Before the United States formally existed, before the framers convened in Philadelphia, and long before the notion of a written constitution became the central instrument of governance in the modern Western world, there existed a political system in North America that had endured for centuries. This was not a system imagined in the abstract or enforced by distant monarchs. It was a living, functioning confederacy of nations, maintained through dialogue, consensus, and a deeply ingrained sense of responsibility to both community and neighbor. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often referred to as the Iroquois League by outsiders, represents one of the most remarkable examples of such governance, an example that would, centuries later, echo quietly in the foundational ideas of the United States Constitution. Understanding this is not simply an exercise in historical curiosity. It reframes the narrative of American political development, suggesting that the creation of the American Republic did not emerge in isolation, but was informed, at least in part, by models that had already demonstrated stability, cooperation, and longevity. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a union of several nations, originally 5, later 6, each with its own distinct culture, territory, and social norms. These nations were bound together not by conquest, but by agreement, and they navigated the difficult terrain of intertribal conflict through an enduring commitment to unity. The Great Law of Peace, which formed the constitutional framework of the Confederacy, was more than a set of rules. It was a moral and practical philosophy designed to prevent the cycles of violence and fragmentation that had once plagued the region. Within this system, power was neither concentrated in a single ruler nor wielded arbitrarily. Authority was conditional, accountability was built into the structure of leadership, and decisions were reached not through edict but through consensus, a painstaking but profoundly stabilizing process. At the heart of the Confederacy was a profound understanding of human and political behavior. The Haudenosaunee leaders recognized that sustainable governance required both flexibility and clarity, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances while remaining anchored to principles that everyone could accept. This understanding was embedded in their institutions, in the ceremonies that marked political gatherings, and in the oral traditions that transmitted knowledge across generations. Leadership roles were not inherited through brute force or hereditary decree alone. They required demonstration of character, wisdom, and service. The selection of leaders, particularly the sachems who represented each nation in the Grand Council, was governed by these principles, ensuring that authority rested on legitimacy rather than coercion. The Confederacy also exemplified a form of federalism long before the term existed in the lexicon of Western political thought. Individual nations retained significant autonomy over internal affairs, yet they ceded authority to a central council on matters of collective concern, such as war, diplomacy, and the negotiation of treaties. This balance between local self-governance and collective decision-making allowed the Confederacy to remain resilient in the face of internal disagreements and external threats. Unlike many early European models of government, which often depended on hierarchical enforcement or military might, the Haudenosaunee system relied on a shared understanding of responsibility, honor, and the consequences of disruption. Consensus, rather than coercion, became the engine of social cohesion. Equally remarkable was the Confederacy's understanding of gender and authority. Clan mothers, elder women who held significant social and political influence, played a crucial role in maintaining accountability and balance. Their power was neither symbolic nor ceremonial alone. They actively nominated and could remove leaders, ensuring that governance remained responsive to the needs of the community. This inclusion of women as active participants in political decision-making created a system of checks and balances that functioned in ways both subtle and profound. Authority, in this context, was relational rather than hierarchical, dependent on trust, reputation, and adherence to shared principles. The Confederacy recognized that stability was not achieved solely through the imposition of rules, but through the cultivation of communal responsibility and moral legitimacy. The historical significance of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is often obscured by the dominant narrative of European colonization. Early observers, including missionaries, traders, and later political thinkers, sometimes dismissed the Confederacy as an anomaly, a curiosity, or a primitive imitation of European governance. Yet those who studied its mechanisms closely were often struck by its sophistication. Benjamin Franklin, for example, documented aspects of Haudenosaunee governance with careful attention, admiring their capacity for unity, diplomacy, and negotiation. Franklin's writings suggest that the practical lessons of the Confederacy were not lost on the minds shaping the American Revolutionary Project, even if they were filtered through the cultural lens of 18th century Enlightenment thought. The Confederacy's ability to govern a complex network of nations with competing interests provided a real-world example of principles that would later find expression, in adapted form, in the debates over federalism, representation, and the separation of powers in the United States. The Confederacy's endurance was not incidental. It was the product of centuries of trial, adaptation, and refinement. Conflict within and among the nations of the League did not disappear, but it was managed with an eye toward long-term stability rather than immediate victory. Disputes were mediated through councils, discussion, and ritual, emphasizing reconciliation over retaliation. Diplomacy was embedded into the very fabric of governance, teaching that negotiation and compromise were not signs of weakness, but of foresight and prudence. This principle of practical, ethically grounded negotiation resonates across centuries, offering a quiet counterpoint to narratives that portray the American founding as entirely novel or self-contained. The Haudenosaunee approach to governance also carried a profound ethical dimension. Decisions were made with consideration not only for the present generation, but for those yet to come. This long-term perspective, codified in the principles of the Great Law of Peace, encouraged leaders to think beyond immediate gains and to consider the consequences of their actions on communal well-being. The notion of intergenerational responsibility, now echoed in modern environmental and social policy discourse, was thus embedded in political practice centuries before it became a topic of academic interest. Governance was inseparable from ethics, and law was inseparable from community. In other words, the Confederacy did not merely regulate behavior. It cultivated a political culture rooted in collective moral accountability. The enduring lesson of this early system is that sophisticated governance does not require the trappings of modernity to function effectively. It requires clarity of principle, a commitment to collective welfare, mechanisms for accountability, and the capacity to reconcile diversity with unity. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy embodied these principles with remarkable consistency over generations, demonstrating that political ingenuity is not confined to Europe or its colonies. Understanding this system reshapes the way we view the origins of American constitutional thought. It invites reflection on the broader networks of influence, adaptation, and observation that contributed to the creation of the United States governing framework. The Confederacy's longevity and coherence challenged the assumption that democratic governance and federal structures were purely Western inventions. Instead, they suggest that the framers were, consciously or unconsciously, building on precedents already visible in their own hemisphere, testing ideas that had already endured the trial of centuries. Yet the story of the Confederacy is not one of unbroken success. The pressures of colonization, the encroachment of European powers, and the later imposition of nation-state borders would test its resilience in unprecedented ways. Even so, the underlying principles of governance, the insistence on dialogue, the recognition of shared authority, and the commitment to collective responsibility remain central to the identity of the Haudenosaunee peoples. These principles offer a lens through which to understand not only the past, but the ongoing interplay between indigenous governance and modern political thought. In this sense, the Haudenosaunee legacy is neither static nor merely historical. It is living, providing insight into the challenges of unity, representation, and accountability that remain relevant today. By beginning with the Confederacy as a point of reference, it becomes possible to reframe the American founding as part of a broader continuum of governance experiments in the Western Hemisphere. It is not a story of imitation, but of intellectual engagement, of observation and adaptation, of learning from a system that had already endured. The Haudenosaunee example demonstrates that foundational ideas about collective governance, the balance of power, and the ethical responsibilities of leaders existed long before the drafting of the United States Constitution, quietly shaping the context in which revolutionary thinkers acted. Recognizing this does not diminish the achievements of the American founders. Rather, it situates those achievements within a richer, more interconnected historical landscape, one in which the search for stability, justice, and communal well-being is a recurring theme across cultures and centuries. In this opening chapter, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy emerges not as a footnote or anecdote, but as a fully realized political entity whose practices provide critical context for understanding the ideas that would later animate the founding of the United States. It is a story of foresight, balance, and durable principles, a reminder that the roots of governance are often deeper and more diverse than conventional narratives allow. By examining this system carefully, we begin to appreciate the complexity, the ingenuity, and the moral vision that guided a people whose influence resonates quietly through the institutions that would come to define a nation. The Confederacy's existence challenges us to reconsider the origins of the U.S. Constitution, not as a solitary creation of European-derived thinkers, but as part of a broader tapestry of political experimentation, negotiation, and ethical governance that span continents and centuries. To understand the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is to immerse oneself in a world shaped by relationships, obligations, and shared responsibilities rather than written edicts alone. Long before European colonists arrived in the northeastern regions of North America, the nations that would come to form the Confederacy had already developed a sophisticated framework of social, political, and spiritual structures. These were societies in which every individual, every family, and every clan occupied a defined place within the larger order. Social cohesion was not enforced merely through punitive measures. It was maintained through a shared understanding of duty, respect, and the consequences of disruption. The laws and norms of these communities were inseparable from the lived experience of the people themselves, embedded in ceremonies, storytelling, and the rhythms of daily life. Each nation within the Confederacy, initially the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, later joined by the Tuscarora, possessed its own distinct identity. These identities were reflected in language, customs, territory, and governance. Yet despite their differences, they shared a commitment to collective stability and mutual defense. Alliances were not abstract. They were woven into every aspect of social organization. For instance, families were structured within clans that extended across villages, creating a network of obligations that ensured accountability and encouraged collaboration. Clan mothers, as central figures in the social hierarchy, oversaw these networks, guiding both moral and political conduct and maintaining a continuity of authority that transcended individual lifetimes. Within this complex social fabric, the distribution of responsibilities was highly intentional. Leadership did not arise from inheritance alone, nor was it simply the product of charisma or force. Instead, it was rooted in service to the community, in the demonstration of wisdom, and in the ability to navigate both conflict and cooperation. The selection of sachems, or council leaders, reflected this ethos. They were nominated by the clan mothers and required to demonstrate a balance of judgment, diplomacy, and dedication. Once in office, their authority was neither absolute nor permanent. It was contingent on continued adherence to the principles of the Great Law of Peace. In this way, leadership was understood as a responsibility rather than a privilege, a moral obligation rather than a reward. The mechanisms of governance extended beyond individual leaders to the collective decision-making processes of the Confederacy. Councils were convened to address matters of common concern, from resolving disputes between nations to negotiating responses to external threats. Decisions were made through dialogue and consensus, a process that required patience, persuasion, and an appreciation for diverse perspectives. Unlike hierarchical models of governance familiar to European observers, which often relied on command and obedience, the Confederacy emphasized participation and deliberation. Each voice carried weight, each objection demanded consideration, and the legitimacy of a decision rested on its acceptance by the community rather than the coercive power of a ruler. This system demanded engagement and accountability, creating a governance model that was resilient precisely because it was participatory. The role of women in Haudenosaunee society was both distinctive and integral. Clan mothers exercised authority that went beyond the ceremonial. They nominated leaders, guided public deliberation, and could depose sachems who failed to serve their communities responsibly. Their involvement ensured that governance was balanced, that power did not become concentrated or abusive, and that decisions reflected a broad spectrum of social experience. This integration of gendered authority into the political system was neither superficial nor symbolic. It was foundational to the Confederacy's stability. By embedding checks and balances directly into social structures, the Haudenosaunee demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how authority could be distributed without weakening cohesion. The Confederacy's approach to diplomacy also reflected its broader worldview. Interaction with other nations, whether allies or potential adversaries, was guided by principles of respect, negotiation, and long-term stability. Treaties were crafted not as temporary expedients, but as expressions of enduring obligations, carefully articulated and reinforced through ritual and record-keeping. Diplomacy extended internally as well. Disagreements between nations were mediated through councils, discussion, and the procedural frameworks established by the Great Law of Peace. Violence was never absent, but it was understood as a failure of negotiation rather than a default solution. In this way, the Confederacy exemplified a political culture in which dialogue, reflection, and moral accountability were central to maintaining order and fostering trust. Economic, social, and spiritual dimensions were also deeply intertwined in Haudenosaunee governance. Communities relied on shared labor, agricultural collaboration, and collective management of resources, fostering interdependence and reinforcing social bonds. Spiritual beliefs reinforced ethical and political principles, providing a moral framework within which governance operated. Decisions were measured against both practical outcomes and the values of the community, with an understanding that law, ethics, and daily life were inseparable. This integration of multiple dimensions, political, social, spiritual, created a governance system that was holistic, adaptable, and deeply rooted in the realities of communal life. Education and knowledge transmission were central to sustaining the Confederacy. Oral traditions, stories, and ceremonies served as vehicles for preserving history, legal principles, and cultural norms. Young members of the society were taught not only practical skills, but also the responsibilities of citizenship and the moral imperatives embedded in governance. Through these means, knowledge and authority were passed across generations in ways that reinforced continuity and stability. The Confederacy did not rely on codified law in the modern sense. Its laws were living practices understood and enacted by the people who were subject to them. This approach reinforced a collective sense of ownership and responsibility, ensuring that governance was participatory and deeply internalized. The Haudenosaunee also developed mechanisms for managing conflict and ensuring justice. Disputes within and between nations were addressed systematically, with mediators appointed to guide the resolution process. These systems emphasized restoration and balance over punishment alone. Accountability was structured and procedural, ensuring that leaders and communities alike adhered to shared principles. Through this framework, the Confederacy managed to maintain cohesion even under stress, demonstrating the effectiveness of a system that prioritized dialogue, ethical responsibility, and the careful distribution of authority. Contact with European settlers introduced new challenges, but it also provided an opportunity to observe how indigenous governance could influence external observers. Colonists and missionaries were often struck by the sophistication of Haudenosaunee councils, the deliberative processes of decision-making, and the inclusion of women in positions of authority. While some dismissed these practices as anomalies or curiosities, others, including figures like Benjamin Franklin, recognized their practical value and enduring logic. The Confederacy's ability to maintain unity and order across multiple nations, each with distinct interests and identities, offered lessons that would resonate far beyond the immediate context of the northeastern woodlands. Understanding the world of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is therefore not merely a matter of recounting historical practices. It is an exploration of a distinct way of organizing human societies. It demonstrates that effective governance does not require centralized authority or coercive power alone, but can emerge from principles of mutual accountability, ethical leadership, and inclusive participation. It highlights the ways in which political, social, and spiritual dimensions can intersect to create durable institutions. And it challenges assumptions about the origins of political innovation, revealing that models of federalism, consensus, and intergenerational responsibility were already present long before they appeared in European-derived constitutions. This world was complex, dynamic, and deeply intentional. Every law, custom, and ritual had purpose, aimed at sustaining harmony and promoting collective welfare. The Haudenosaunee understood that governance was not simply about managing the present. It was about safeguarding the future, cultivating leaders who would serve ethically, and creating structures capable of enduring generations. In a sense, their society functioned as a living experiment in political stability, a testament to the capacity of human communities to organize themselves with sophistication, foresight, and moral coherence. By examining the social, cultural, and political landscape of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, we gain more than historical insight. We gain a lens through which to understand the broader currents that shaped the early American continent, the intellectual and practical context in which colonial leaders operated, and the possibilities inherent in alternative forms of governance. The Confederacy was not a peripheral curiosity. It was a sophisticated, fully realized system of political and social organization, capable of maintaining cohesion across multiple nations, guiding leaders through ethical frameworks, and embedding accountability at every level. Its lessons are subtle, often overlooked, but profoundly important for understanding the interplay between indigenous governance and emerging colonial political thought. As the Haudenosaunee navigated their own internal complexities and interacted with external powers, they demonstrated that governance is as much about relationships and shared understanding as it is about codified rules. Their society illustrates that principles such as unity, accountability, and ethical responsibility can be institutionalized without recourse to coercion, and that durable political systems rely on engagement, deliberation, and moral legitimacy. In examining this world, we are reminded that the history of governance in North America is richer and more layered than conventional narratives allow, and that the ideas underpinning the United States Constitution did not emerge in a vacuum, but were informed, consciously or unconsciously, by models of political sophistication already present on the continent. The Great Law of Peace, the foundational covenant of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, emerges not as a simple collection of rules, but as a profound moral and political philosophy, designed to transform the turbulence of intertribal conflict into enduring cooperation. Centuries before the codified constitutions of European powers would dominate global political discourse, the Haudenosaunee nations had already confronted the challenges of internal strife, competition for resources, and the human propensity for violence. In response, they crafted a system that balanced authority with accountability, freedom with responsibility, and diversity with unity. The Great Law was not merely a theoretical framework. It was a lived reality, enacted through ceremonies, rituals, and the deliberate engagement of every individual within the nations. To understand its significance is to recognize that governance, in this context, was inseparable from ethics, culture, and the everyday practices that sustain community life. The origins of the Great Law of Peace are rooted in a period of upheaval and conflict. Prior to the formation of the Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee nations had endured generations of warfare, territorial disputes, and cycles of retaliation that threatened their survival. Violence was not abstract. It was immediate and personal, affecting families, villages, and the stability of entire nations. The law emerged as a deliberate effort to interrupt these cycles, to impose structure where previously only chaos had reigned, and to offer a framework through which disputes could be resolved without resorting to the destruction of kin and neighbor. It was, in essence, a conscious attempt to institutionalize peace, transforming it from aspiration into practice. At its core, the Great Law of Peace emphasizes unity achieved through voluntary agreement and shared commitment rather than coercion. Each nation retained its autonomy and maintained control over internal affairs. It pledged allegiance to the collective welfare of the Confederacy as a whole. Decisions of common concern, whether in matters of war, diplomacy, or resource management, were deliberated within councils, where the voices of all participating nations were heard and reconciled. Consensus was not superficial. It required genuine engagement, negotiation, and compromise. The law recognized that unity could not be imposed by force or dictated from above. It had to be cultivated through dialogue and reinforced through ongoing accountability. In this way, the Confederacy exemplified a political culture that prioritized the collective good while respecting the sovereignty of individual nations. The Great Law also articulated a clear vision of ethical governance. Leaders were entrusted with authority, but that authority was conditional, monitored, and morally grounded. Sachems, who represented each nation in the Grand Council, were expected to act in the interest of the people, guided by principles of justice, foresight, and communal welfare. The clan mothers played a central role in this oversight, nominating leaders, guiding deliberations, and holding them accountable to their responsibilities. This system ensured that power was distributed, balanced, and transparent, mitigating the risk of abuse or despotism. Authority was therefore inseparable from obligation. Leaders could not govern for personal gain, but were called to serve as stewards of both community and law. Ceremony and ritual were crucial to the enactment of the Great Law. Political gatherings were not merely administrative meetings. They were sacred observances that reinforced moral and social bonds. The law was communicated and remembered through storytelling, symbolic acts, and formal declarations, embedding principles of governance within cultural consciousness. These practices ensured that the law was not abstract or distant, but lived, understood, and internalized by every member of the Confederacy. By intertwining governance with ritual, the Haudenosaunee created a system in which ethical and political imperatives were inseparable, ensuring that adherence to law was both socially reinforced and spiritually grounded. One of the most striking aspects of the Great Law is its attention to human behavior and motivation. The architects of the Confederacy understood that laws alone cannot prevent conflict. They must be accompanied by mechanisms that account for the complexities of human relationships. To this end, the law provided structures for mediation, dispute resolution, and restorative justice, emphasizing reconciliation rather than retaliation. Disputes within and between nations were addressed systematically, with appointed mediators guiding discussion and negotiation. The aim was to repair relationships, restore balance, and prevent escalation. This approach reflects a sophisticated understanding of human dynamics, recognizing that sustainable peace requires more than deterrence. It requires engagement with the underlying causes of discord. The Great Law also embodies an understanding of collective responsibility and intergenerational obligation. Decisions were not made solely with the present in mind. Leaders and citizens alike were expected to consider the impact of their actions on future generations. This principle of foresight was central to governance, encouraging prudent decision-making and long-term stability. In essence, the law created a political culture in which ethical reflection, communal accountability, and temporal awareness were integrated into every aspect of leadership and social participation. By embedding these values into governance, The Confederacy ensured that political and moral considerations were inseparable, fostering resilience and continuity over centuries. Gender played a fundamental role in shaping the application and enforcement of the Great Law. Women, particularly clan mothers, were entrusted with the nomination and oversight of leaders, ensuring that power remained accountable to the broader community. Their participation was not symbolic. It was operational and consequential. By incorporating women into the highest levels of decision-making, the Confederacy institutionalized a system of checks and balances that mitigated the risk of centralized authority and promoted equitable governance. This approach contrasts sharply with many contemporary European models, where political power was concentrated in male-dominated hierarchies and legitimacy derived from inheritance or coercion rather than communal trust. The law's approach to conflict, diplomacy, and alliance building also demonstrates remarkable strategic sophistication. The Confederacy navigated relationships both within its own network of nations and with external powers, recognizing the importance of negotiation, long-term planning, and mutual obligation. Treaties and agreements were reinforced through ritual and formalized processes, ensuring that commitments were binding not only in practice but in principle. Diplomacy was understood as an ongoing, dynamic process requiring attention to relationships, obligations, and the balance of interests. In this sense, the Great Law anticipated principles of federalism, negotiation, and shared sovereignty that would later appear in modern constitutions, while remaining grounded in the specific context of indigenous governance. Equally notable is the adaptability of the Great Law. It was not rigid or static. It evolved to meet the needs of changing circumstances, incorporating new insights, addressing emerging conflicts, and mediating disputes with flexibility and foresight. This adaptability was critical to the Confederacy's longevity, enabling it to withstand internal pressures and external threats over centuries. Unlike rigid legal codes that struggle to respond to unforeseen challenges, the Great Law functioned as a living framework, responsive to context while anchored in enduring principles of unity, accountability, and moral responsibility. The law also shaped the social and cultural fabric of the Confederacy, intertwining governance with everyday life. Individuals understood their roles and obligations within the broader system, and social cohesion was maintained through shared ethical norms, ceremonial reinforcement, and collective participation. Governance was thus not a distant abstraction. It was a lived reality, experienced in every act of community interaction, negotiation, and dispute resolution. The integration of ethical principles into practical governance created a society in which order, stability, and moral coherence were mutually reinforcing, rather than artificially imposed from above. Recognition of the Great Law of Peace by European observers highlights its sophistication and enduring impact. While some dismissed it as primitive or anecdotal, others, including prominent colonial figures, acknowledged its effectiveness and resilience. Its emphasis on unity, ethical leadership, and deliberative decision-making offered a model that contrasted sharply with the hierarchical, coercive systems familiar to the colonists. In this sense, the Confederacy's governance provided a practical and philosophical example of how diverse nations could coexist, cooperate, and sustain collective well-being over long periods of time. Ultimately, the Great Law of Peace illustrates that governance is not solely a matter of codified regulations or centralized authority. It is a complex interplay of ethics, accountability, dialogue, and social cohesion. The Confederacy demonstrates that sustainable political systems emerge from principles deeply embedded in culture and community, reinforced through practice, ceremony, and shared understanding. By codifying these principles into the Great Law, the Haudenosaunee created a framework that was durable, adaptable, and morally coherent, providing stability in a world that had long been marked by conflict and uncertainty. In examining the Great Law, it becomes clear that the Confederacy's governance was both practical and visionary. It addressed immediate challenges, such as intertribal conflict and leadership accountability, while also anticipating the needs of future generations. It integrated ethical reflection into political practice, distributed authority in a balanced manner, and emphasized the centrality of dialogue, negotiation, and consensus. In doing so, it created a system that was resilient, enduring, and profoundly influential in ways that would quietly reverberate through subsequent political thought in North America. By situating the great law of peace at the center of Haudenosaunee society, we begin to understand that the Confederacy was far more than a collection of tribes. It was a sophisticated political organism, capable of sustaining order, promoting cooperation, and balancing individual and collective interests across centuries. Its lessons extend beyond the historical moment, offering insight into the principles of governance, ethics, and human organization that remain relevant in contemporary discourse. The law stands as a testament to the ingenuity, foresight, and moral imagination of the Haudenosaunee peoples, demonstrating that effective governance is as much about principles and relationships as it is about structures and procedures. The confederated structure of the Haudenosaunee was one of the most remarkable features of their governance, a system that allowed multiple nations to operate independently while simultaneously cooperating on issues of common concern. Unlike many political systems that rely on centralized authority or coercion to enforce unity, the Haudenosaunee model relied on a balance between local autonomy and collective responsibility. Each nation retained control over its internal affairs, from community rituals and economic management to local leadership and social disputes. Yet when it came to decisions affecting the Confederacy as a whole, matters such as intertribal diplomacy, collective defense, or responses to external threats, power shifted to the Grand Council, where representatives from each nation convened to deliberate and reach consensus. This delicate equilibrium of sovereignty and shared authority created a form of federalism long before the term existed in Western political thought. The Grand Council was not a ceremonial body or an advisory committee. It was the central mechanism through which the Confederacy achieved cohesion. Sachems, nominated by the clan mothers of each nation, acted as representatives, conveying the perspectives and interests of their communities while also negotiating for the good of the Confederacy as a whole. The council operated on a principle of dialogue and persuasion rather than command. Decisions were made only when consensus was reached, a process that often required prolonged discussion, careful listening, and the willingness to reconcile differing priorities. In this way, power was distributed, legitimacy was earned through agreement, and the collective welfare of the Confederacy took precedence over the ambitions of any individual or nation. This approach required not only political skill, but also a deep understanding of human nature and the complexities of social relations. The leaders of the Haudenosaunee recognized that disputes were inevitable, that interests would diverge, and that conflict could threaten the stability of the entire system. To mitigate these risks, the Confederacy developed norms and procedures that encouraged negotiation, compromise, and accountability. Decisions reached in the Grand Council were binding, but they were binding because they were embraced collectively, not imposed by force. This distinction is critical. Legitimacy was grounded in consent and moral authority rather than coercive power, and the ability to maintain unity relied on the shared recognition of mutual obligation. The confederated system also allowed for flexibility in addressing emergencies or crises. While autonomy was preserved for routine matters, extraordinary circumstances required collaboration and coordination. For instance, when neighboring nations threatened the security of one member, or when internal conflicts threatened to destabilize the balance of power, the Grand Council could mobilize resources and provide guidance, ensuring that the response was both coordinated and principled. This capacity for collective action, combined with respect for individual nation sovereignty, created a governance structure that was remarkably resilient. It could absorb shocks, adapt to changing circumstances, and maintain order even under considerable stress, without resorting to centralized domination. Equally important was the Confederacy's emphasis on accountability and moral oversight. Leaders were chosen not by coercion or inheritance alone, but by their demonstrated capacity for wisdom, ethical judgment, and service. Clan mothers played an essential role in this process, not only nominating and advising leaders, but also ensuring that they remained faithful to the principles of the Great Law of Peace. If a leader failed to act in accordance with these responsibilities, the clan mothers could remove them from office. This mechanism created a system of checks and balances that prevented the concentration of power, promoted ethical governance, and reinforced the collective authority of the nations. Authority was never abstract. It was relational, dependent on trust, competence, and adherence to shared values. The Confederacy's federalism was also evident in the way it handled internal disputes among the nations. Conflicts over territory, resources, or policy were mediated through councils that emphasized dialogue and reconciliation. The goal was not to punish or humiliate, but to restore balance and preserve the integrity of the Union. Mediators and council members guided these processes with careful attention to both the facts of the dispute and the broader social and moral principles at stake. By institutionalizing negotiation and reconciliation, the Confederacy created a system in which disagreements could be managed constructively, reducing the risk of escalation and ensuring that unity was maintained even amid diversity. Trade, alliances, and external relations further demonstrated the sophistication of this confederated system. Each nation could conduct its own affairs to some degree, but diplomacy with outsiders, whether neighboring indigenous nations or European settlers, was coordinated through the Grand Council. This allowed the Confederacy to present a unified front, negotiate more effectively, and protect the collective interests of all member nations. The ability to balance local independence with coordinated external action was a hallmark of Haudenosaunee federalism, reflecting both strategic insight and a nuanced understanding of political complexity. The Confederacy's leaders recognized that autonomy without unity would leave them vulnerable, while unity without autonomy would stifle the individuality and agency of the member nations. Their solution was a dynamic equilibrium that preserved both. The confederated structure also encouraged deliberation and long-term thinking. Because decisions required consensus, leaders were compelled to consider multiple perspectives, anticipate consequences, and engage in extended discussion. This process slowed hasty action but produced outcomes that were more durable and broadly supported. In effect, the Confederacy institutionalized reflection as a political principle, embedding the values of prudence, patience, and inclusivity into its decision-making structures. This approach contrasts with systems in which decisions are made unilaterally or hastily, often producing instability or resentment. In the Haudenosaunee system, governance was both a collective responsibility and a moral exercise, demanding that leaders act with foresight, integrity, and consideration for the broader community. The Confederacy's federalism was also intimately connected to the ethical and spiritual dimensions of Haudenosaunee life. Governance was not divorced from culture or morality. It was embedded in ceremonies, storytelling, and the ongoing practice of communal obligations. Decisions made in council were reinforced through ritual, ethical instruction, and the lived experience of the people. This integration of moral and political authority created a system in which law and ethics were inseparable, and where adherence to governance structures was internalized rather than enforced externally. The Confederacy thus maintained cohesion not merely through formal rules, but through shared understanding, cultural reinforcement, and collective responsibility. Education and socialization further reinforced the Confederacy's federal structure. Young members of the society were taught from an early age about the responsibilities of citizenship, the obligations of leadership, and the principles that underpin the Great Law of Peace. They learned the value of negotiation, the importance of ethical decision-making, and the interconnectedness of individual and collective welfare. This process ensured continuity, transmitting the principles of federal governance across generations and maintaining the Confederacy's stability over centuries. Governance was thus not imposed from above, but cultivated from within, deeply embedded in the consciousness and practice of the community. The confederated system of the Haudenosaunee also offers insight into the evolution of ideas that would later appear in colonial political thought. European observers, including Benjamin Franklin and other early American thinkers, noted the Confederacy's capacity to unite multiple nations under a common framework without suppressing local autonomy. While it would be an oversimplification to say that the United States Constitution directly copied these models, the conceptual parallels are striking. The Haudenosaunee demonstrated that federal structures, balanced authority, and deliberative decision-making could operate successfully over long periods, offering a practical and enduring example of governance in a diverse, decentralized context. Their experience showed that unity and independence were not mutually exclusive, but could be harmonized through principles, negotiation, and institutional design. The Confederacy's federalism was not merely a political convenience. It reflected a profound understanding of human nature, social dynamics, and the complexities of governance. By allowing local autonomy, while coordinating collective action, embedding accountability into leadership, and emphasizing dialogue and consensus, the Haudenosaunee created a system that was both resilient and ethically coherent. Power was exercised with responsibility, decisions were made with foresight, and the interests of the collective were continuously balanced against those of individual nations. This approach allowed the Confederacy to endure for centuries, adapting to internal challenges and external pressures while preserving its identity and cohesion. The lesson of Haudenosaunee federalism lies not only in its structural design, but in its underlying philosophy. Governance is most effective when it is participatory, morally grounded, and attentive to both autonomy and unity. Authority gains legitimacy through consent, accountability, and ethical responsibility rather than through coercion. Conflict is managed through dialogue and mediation rather than through force. Decisions are durable when they reflect the perspectives and needs of multiple stakeholders. In this sense, the Haudenosaunee Confederated structure is more than a historical artifact. It is a model of governance that continues to offer insight into the principles of federalism, consensus building, and sustainable political organization. Through this system, the Haudenosaunee demonstrated that diversity need not undermine cohesion, that multiple centers of authority can coexist, and that long-term stability is achievable when ethical principles, deliberation, and accountability are embedded in governance. Their confederated structure was both practical and visionary, capable of addressing the immediate needs of the nations while also anticipating the challenges of future generations. It remains a testament to the ingenuity, foresight, and ethical sophistication of the Haudenosaunee peoples, illustrating that federalism is not merely a theoretical concept, but a living practice rooted in the careful balance of autonomy, responsibility, and collective welfare. Central to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's enduring stability was its deliberate rejection of centralized, authoritarian power. Unlike many contemporary societies in the 17th and 18th centuries, where rulers governed with near-absolute authority, the Haudenosaunee understood that the consolidation of power in a single individual or office could easily lead to abuse, discord, and eventual collapse. Authority within their political system was never unilateral. It was carefully constrained, distributed across multiple layers of responsibility, and constantly checked by social, ethical, and institutional mechanisms. This principle, rejection of concentrated power, was not merely theoretical, but practical, embedded in every aspect of the Confederacy's governance, from the structure of councils to the role of clan mothers and community oversight. It was a system designed to channel human ambition toward communal good, rather than allowing it to dominate through force or fear. At the heart of this system was the understanding that leadership is a moral responsibility, not a personal entitlement. Leaders, or sachems, were nominated by clan mothers on the basis of their wisdom, temperament, and proven service to the community. Their authority was conditional and could be revoked if they failed to uphold the principles of the Great Law of Peace. This conditional authority created a continuous accountability loop, ensuring that leaders acted in the interest of their people rather than for personal gain. Leadership was therefore inseparable from ethical conduct. It was a position of stewardship rather than domination. The Confederacy recognized that sustainable governance depended not on fear, coercion, or inherited privilege, but on leaders earning and maintaining the trust of those they represented. Decision-making processes within the Confederacy were similarly structured to prevent authoritarian control. Councils operated on consensus, a system that required each representative to engage with opposing viewpoints, negotiate differences, and arrive at mutually acceptable solutions. Unlike hierarchical systems where decisions could be imposed top-down, the Haudenosaunee process forced deliberation, compromise, and persuasion. Consensus was not a formality or a superficial gesture. It was a rigorous process demanding active participation, careful reasoning, and respect for diverse perspectives. This emphasis on participatory governance ensured that no individual could dominate the decision-making process and that the interests of the collective were prioritized over personal ambition. The rejection of centralized authority extended to both the local and Confederate levels. Each nation within the League retained considerable autonomy over its internal affairs, from dispute resolution and community rituals to resource management and social norms. At the same time, decisions affecting the Confederacy as a whole were mediated through the Grand Council, where consensus was required to enact collective measures. This dual structure ensured a delicate balance between independence and unity. Nations could manage their own affairs without interference, yet they remained accountable to the collective commitments of the Confederacy. This equilibrium prevented power from consolidating in any single office or nation and fostered resilience against both internal and external pressures. The role of women, particularly the clan mothers, was integral to this rejection of concentrated power. Clan mothers wielded authority that was both formal and practical. They nominated leaders, advised councils, and monitored the performance of sachems, holding them accountable for ethical lapses or failures in governance. Importantly, they possessed the power to remove leaders who acted contrary to the principles of the Great Law. By institutionalizing female oversight at the highest levels of political authority, the Confederacy embedded a system of checks and balances that preempted authoritarian consolidation. Power was not simply divided among men. It was distributed in a way that relied on relational responsibility, ethical accountability, and communal trust. Consensus governance also reinforced this anti-authoritarian structure. The requirement that decisions be collectively agreed upon prevented unilateral action, forced negotiation, and encouraged inclusive deliberation. Representatives had to account for both the specific needs of their nation and the broader welfare of the Confederacy. This process ensured that power was exercised transparently, deliberatively, and ethically. Leaders could propose initiatives, advocate for positions, and persuade others, but they could not impose their will. Authority was contingent upon dialogue, collaboration, and shared agreement, creating a political culture in which coercion had no place and consensus became the engine of stability. The rejection of authoritarianism extended beyond the mechanics of leadership to the broader societal understanding of political legitimacy. The Haudenosaunee recognized that coercion and force were inherently unstable methods of maintaining order. A leader who ruled through fear might secure short-term compliance, but would erode trust, provoke resentment, and threaten the cohesion of the community. By contrast, a system in which authority was earned, monitored, and distributed created stability and resilience. People were invested in governance because they had a voice, because leaders were accountable, and because the rules of engagement were grounded in both ethics and social norms. Political legitimacy was relational, earned through service, and reinforced through the continuous practice of accountability and oversight. Education and socialization played a key role in sustaining this anti-authoritarian ethos. From a young age, members of Haudenosaunee society were taught the principles of ethical leadership, consensus building, and communal responsibility. Children learned that authority carried obligations, that decisions affected future generations, and that the stability of the community depended on the participation and integrity of every individual. These lessons were reinforced through storytelling, ritual, and participation in councils, creating a society in which the rejection of authoritarianism was internalized as a value rather than imposed externally. Governance was, therefore, a lived experience embedded in cultural practice, ethical expectation, and social reinforcement. This rejection of concentrated power also shaped the Confederacy's approach to conflict and external relations. In dealings with neighboring nations or European colonists, the Confederacy negotiated collectively rather than through unilateral decisions. Military actions, trade agreements, and diplomatic alliances were determined through council deliberation, balancing the needs of individual nations with the collective interest of the Confederacy. This ensured that no single leader could commit the entire league to a course of action without the consent of others. Authority was diffused, decisions were deliberated, and collective responsibility prevented both rash action and personal ambition from dominating the political process. The Confederacy's model stands in stark contrast to many contemporary European systems of governance. In monarchies and principalities, power was concentrated, hierarchical, and often inherited, leaving little room for accountability or consensus. The Haudenosaunee, by contrast, created a system in which authority was relational, conditional, and contingent upon service. The focus was on moral responsibility, deliberative decision-making, and collective welfare rather than coercion, prestige, or personal enrichment. This rejection of centralized power was not only ethical but practical. It fostered stability, mitigated conflict, and allowed the Confederacy to endure across generations. At a deeper level, the rejection of authoritarianism reflected a sophisticated understanding of human behavior and political dynamics. The Haudenosaunee recognized that ambition, competition, and interpersonal tension are inherent to human societies. They also understood that institutional design can channel these tendencies in ways that support cohesion rather than undermine it. By distributing authority, embedding checks and balances, and prioritizing consensus and accountability, the Confederacy created a system that harnessed human energies productively. Leadership was a responsibility, power was temporary and conditional, and governance was a collaborative moral exercise. In practice, this meant that the Confederacy could manage both internal and external challenges with remarkable resilience. Internal disputes were mediated and reconciled. Leadership failures could be addressed without destabilizing the entire system. And the collective decision-making process ensured that no individual or faction could impose their will arbitrarily. External threats were met with coordinated strategies, carefully negotiated agreements, and collective defense, all of which were enabled by the distribution of authority and the ethical grounding of leadership. The rejection of centralized, authoritarian power was thus inseparable from the Confederacy's broader ability to sustain itself, adapt to challenges, and endure across centuries. By studying the Haudenosaunee, it becomes clear that governance does not require absolute rulers or coercive authority to function effectively. Authority can be distributed, leadership can be conditional, and stability can be achieved through ethics, accountability, and deliberation. The Confederacy demonstrates that rejecting authoritarianism does not weaken governance. On the contrary, it strengthens it by fostering trust, participation, and resilience. Leaders serve, communities engage, and power is exercised with responsibility. Principles that resonate not only historically, but in contemporary considerations of effective political systems. The Haudenosaunee example challenges assumptions about the necessity of concentrated power for governance, offering a model in which authority, accountability, and collective responsibility are mutually reinforcing. By embedding these principles in social structures, political institutions, and cultural practices, the Confederacy ensured that leadership remained ethical, decisions were deliberated, and the community remained cohesive. Their rejection of centralized power was both ethical and practical, demonstrating that stability, order, and resilience are achievable not through domination, but through distributed authority, moral responsibility, and participatory governance. The political structure of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was distinguished not only by its federalist design and consensus-driven governance, but by the central and enduring role of women in maintaining authority, balance, and continuity. Among the most influential figures within this system were the clan mothers, matriarchs whose power was both formalized and deeply respected. Their authority extended far beyond symbolic or ceremonial roles. They were active participants in governance, shaping decisions, monitoring leadership, and safeguarding the ethical integrity of the Confederacy. In a society often interpreted through a patriarchal lens by outsiders, the Haudenosaunee demonstrated a striking recognition of women's capacity for political oversight, moral judgment, and long-term strategic thinking. Their inclusion was not incidental. It was foundational, ensuring that the Confederacy remained resilient, balanced, and ethically grounded over generations. Clan mothers were responsible for nominating leaders, particularly sachems, who would represent the nations in the Grand Council. This nomination was far from a simple procedural act. It required careful consideration of the candidate's wisdom, character, service, and ability to act in the interests of the community rather than personal ambition. Clan mothers drew upon intimate knowledge of individuals' histories, reputations, and capacities, and their choices carried significant weight. Once leaders were installed, the clan mothers continued to oversee their conduct, offering guidance, instruction, and counsel. If a leader failed to act in accordance with the principles of the Great Law of Peace, they could be removed from office, ensuring accountability at the highest levels of political authority. In this way, power was exercised relationally, ethically, and continuously monitored, creating a system in which governance could not be divorced from morality. The oversight of clan mothers extended beyond individual leadership to the broader ethical and strategic health of the Confederacy. They played a critical role in mediating disputes, advising councils, and ensuring that decisions reflected both local and collective interests. Their perspective was informed by social knowledge, moral reasoning, and an understanding of the interconnections between families, clans, and nations. In a society in which authority was distributed and consensus-driven, the insight and judgment of women provided an essential stabilizing influence. They acted as guardians of balance, ensuring that power was not concentrated, that ethical obligations were honored, and that long-term sustainability was prioritized over immediate gain. This inclusion of women in governance reflects a sophisticated understanding of societal dynamics. The Haudenosaunee recognized that ethical, balanced decision-making requires multiple perspectives and that the exclusion of significant voices weakens political structures. By integrating women into the processes of leadership selection, accountability, and mediation, the Confederacy not only prevented the concentration of power, but also harnessed the insights and judgment of individuals who possessed intimate knowledge of social networks, familial responsibilities, and communal well-being. Authority was therefore relational, embedded within a network of responsibilities, rather than concentrated in a single office or dominated by coercion. The political influence of women extended to the functioning of councils and deliberative bodies as well. While male sachems represented the nations in the Grand Council, clan mothers advised, guided, and influenced these discussions from the background, ensuring that decisions were considered, inclusive, and aligned with communal ethics. Their authority was subtle yet potent, shaping outcomes, monitoring compliance, and reinforcing the principles of the Great Law. This dynamic created a system of checks and balances that complemented the procedural mechanisms of consensus, preventing the potential domination of individuals or factions while maintaining the coherence and unity of the Confederacy. The presence of women in positions of authority also had broader social and ethical implications. By institutionalizing female oversight, the Confederacy embedded the principle that power carries responsibility, that leadership is conditional, and that authority must serve the collective good. The ethical framework of governance was reinforced through practice. Leaders were accountable not only to their peers, but to the women who had appointed and supervised them. Decisions were therefore evaluated not solely on efficiency or expedience, but on their alignment with moral and communal imperatives. This structure ensured that the exercise of power was tempered by wisdom, foresight, and ethical consideration, and that governance was inseparable from the principles of justice and responsibility. The influence of clan mothers extended beyond the internal mechanics of government to the long-term strategic and social stability of the Confederacy. They were key actors in maintaining intergenerational continuity, teaching younger members of the community about ethical leadership, the responsibilities of citizenship, and the principles of collective welfare. By embedding these lessons within cultural practice, ritual, and daily life, they ensured that governance principles were internalized across generations. This education and socialization process reinforced the anti-authoritarian, consensus-based character of the Confederacy, creating a political culture in which leadership was understood as a service and power as a responsibility. The oversight of women was particularly crucial during moments of potential crisis or conflict. In situations where disputes threatened to escalate, where leaders faced ethical dilemmas, or where external pressures challenged the Confederacy's cohesion, clan mothers acted as stabilizing agents. Their guidance encouraged deliberation, negotiation, and adherence to the principles of the Great Law, preventing rash or unilateral actions that could jeopardize the collective welfare. By exercising authority in these ways, women played an essential role in preserving both the ethical and structural integrity of the Confederacy, demonstrating that governance is as much about relational influence and moral oversight as it is about formal power structures. The ethical dimension of female authority was deeply intertwined with spiritual and cultural practices. Governance was inseparable from the moral and ceremonial frameworks of Haudenosaunee society, and the leadership of women reflected an integration of ethical, social, and political responsibilities. Clan mothers not only monitored the actions of leaders, but ensured that governance was aligned with communal values, spiritual principles, and long-term sustainability. This integration created a governance system in which authority, ethics, and cultural cohesion were mutually reinforcing, producing a resilience that allowed the Confederacy to endure over centuries. The inclusion of women also demonstrates a broader principle about the distribution and exercise of power. By embedding oversight, accountability, and ethical judgment within multiple layers of society, the Haudenosaunee prevented the concentration of power and promoted collective responsibility. Governance was not a unilateral endeavor. It was relational, participatory, and morally grounded. Leaders were supported, guided, and restrained by those around them, ensuring that decisions were both effective and aligned with communal values. This structure exemplifies a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, social dynamics, and the risks of concentrated authority, creating a model of governance that is both practical and principled. Furthermore, the political role of women extended to the negotiation of social norms and the maintenance of justice within the community. Clan mothers ensured that decisions reflected fairness, balanced interests, and respect for the interconnected obligations of families, clans, and nations. Their authority reinforced the principle that power must serve communal welfare, and that leadership without accountability was unsustainable. By exercising influence over both the procedural and ethical dimensions of governance, women acted as guardians of stability, justice, and moral coherence, ensuring that the Confederacy could navigate both internal and external challenges with consistency and integrity. Education, mentorship, and intergenerational continuity were integral to this system. Clan mothers imparted knowledge, values, and practical wisdom to younger generations, fostering an understanding of governance that was relational, ethical, and participatory. They reinforced lessons about the responsibilities of leaders, the mechanisms of accountability, and the importance of consensus in decision-making. Through storytelling, ritual, and daily practice, they ensured that the principles underpinning the Confederacy's governance were internalized, sustaining the stability and resilience of the system across time. Authority was thus taught as a duty, leadership as stewardship, and governance as an ethical exercise embedded in the fabric of society. The role of women in Haudenosaunee governance also challenges conventional assumptions about the sources of political power. By institutionalizing female authority, the Confederacy demonstrated that sustainable governance requires multiple perspectives, moral oversight, and distributed responsibility. Leadership was never concentrated, decisions were deliberated, and ethical accountability was embedded into the system itself. Women were not auxiliary participants. They were central to the operation, integrity, and continuity of the political system, ensuring that governance remained principled, balanced, and resilient. Ultimately, the political influence of women was inseparable from the Confederacy's stability, ethical grounding, and long-term resilience. Clan mothers ensured that leaders acted responsibly, that decisions reflected collective interests, and that the Confederacy adhered to the principles of the Great Law of Peace. Their oversight created a system of checks and balances that prevented the concentration of power, fostered ethical decision-making, and reinforced relational accountability. By embedding authority in both men and women, the Haudenosaunee produced a governance system that was inclusive, morally coherent, and structurally resilient, demonstrating the enduring power of balanced and participatory leadership. The encounter between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and European colonists introduced a new and complex dimension to the political and social landscape of northeastern North America. Prior to sustained European contact, the Haudenosaunee had developed governance systems, social structures, and ethical frameworks that allowed them to thrive, maintain unity, and resolve conflict across multiple nations. These systems were adaptive, durable, and sophisticated, capable of balancing local autonomy with collective responsibility. When Europeans arrived, they encountered a confederacy that was already organized, disciplined, and capable of long-term strategic thinking, challenging any assumptions that indigenous governance was primitive or undeveloped. The initial interactions between these two worlds were thus shaped by both curiosity and misunderstanding, cooperation and tension, and by the slow recognition that the Haudenosaunee were not merely subjects of colonization, but active participants in shaping regional politics. European observers were struck by the structural and ethical sophistication of Haudenosaunee governance. Figures such as early missionaries, traders, and later colonial leaders took note of the Grand Council, the deliberative processes, and the role of clan mothers in selecting and monitoring leaders. The Confederacy's capacity for consensus decision-making, the ethical oversight embedded in leadership, and the inclusion of women in positions of authority contrasted sharply with the hierarchical, patriarchal, and often coercive systems familiar to Europeans. Some dismissed these practices as anomalies or curiosities, failing to appreciate their operational depth. Others, however, including Benjamin Franklin and certain colonial diplomats, recognized their practical value, noting the Confederacy's ability to maintain cohesion across multiple nations, negotiate disputes, and respond collectively to external threats. The Haudenosaunee thus provided Europeans with a living example of governance based on distributed power, ethical accountability, and deliberative consensus. Trade and diplomacy became central arenas in which European colonists first engaged with the Confederacy. Fur trade networks, territorial negotiations, and military alliances required careful coordination and trust-building. The Haudenosaunee, with their sophisticated understanding of negotiation and their capacity for strategic foresight, approached these interactions deliberately. They recognized that each engagement carried implications not only for their own nations, but for the Confederacy as a whole. Leaders weighed the immediate benefits of trade or alliance against potential long-term consequences, ensuring that decisions aligned with both collective welfare and the ethical principles of the Great Law of Peace. European observers often misinterpreted this cautious pragmatism as indecision or inefficiency, failing to grasp that the Haudenosaunee were negotiating not merely for material gain, but for political and ethical balance. Military alliances provided another lens through which Europeans began to appreciate the Confederacy's strategic sophistication. During periods of conflict, both among indigenous nations and in the broader context of European colonial rivalries, the Haudenosaunee demonstrated remarkable discipline and coordination. Decisions to engage in warfare, provide support to allies, or pursue peace were mediated through councils, negotiated among nations, and guided by ethical considerations. No single leader could unilaterally commit the Confederacy to action. Consensus and collective deliberation ensured that decisions were calculated, justified, and sustainable. European forces, accustomed to hierarchically commanded armies and centralized decision-making, were often surprised by the efficacy of this system, particularly given its decentralized and consensus-driven nature. The Confederacy's approach to diplomacy and alliance-making further illustrated the integration of ethical and strategic considerations in governance. Treaties were not ephemeral instruments of convenience, but formal agreements reinforced through ritual, social expectation, and communal memory. When the Haudenosaunee entered into negotiations with European powers, they insisted upon clear terms, mutual obligations, and enforceable ethical expectations. This was not legalistic in the European sense, but was grounded in communal authority, relational accountability, and a shared moral understanding. Violations of agreements carried both political and ethical consequences, reinforcing the Confederacy's reputation for integrity and consistency. These practices challenged European notions of governance, law, and diplomacy, highlighting a model in which political, social, and ethical imperatives were deeply intertwined. The ethical dimension of the Haudenosaunee's interactions with Europeans was matched by a sophisticated understanding of the risks and opportunities of external contact. The Confederacy was acutely aware that European settlement, trade, and military expansion could pose existential threats. Leaders used their deliberative processes to weigh these risks, coordinate defensive strategies, and negotiate terms that protected sovereignty. The Confederacy's ability to respond strategically while maintaining ethical and internal governance norms reflects a deep comprehension of power dynamics, risk management, and long-term planning. In essence, the Haudenosaunee approached European contact not as passive recipients of colonial influence, but as active participants shaping the conditions of engagement. The role of women remained central during this period of external contact. Clan mothers continued to exercise oversight, ensuring that leaders negotiating with European powers acted ethically, maintained accountability, and considered the long-term consequences of their decisions. Their authority provided a stabilizing force, preventing rash or opportunistic actions from compromising the integrity of the Confederacy. By embedding ethical oversight into the political process, the Haudenosaunee maintained a continuity of principles even in the face of unprecedented external pressures. Leadership, negotiation, and diplomacy were thus inseparable from moral responsibility, guided by both institutional practice and cultural expectation. European observers began to document aspects of Haudenosaunee governance that would later influence colonial political thought. The decentralized yet coordinated Confederacy, the ethical oversight embedded in leadership, and the deliberative consensus model provided tangible evidence that federalist structures could function effectively in practice. Benjamin Franklin, in particular, drew parallels between Haudenosaunee councils and his own ideas about union, suggesting that lessons could be learned from the Confederacy's long-standing success in balancing autonomy with collective responsibility. While it would be inaccurate to claim that the United States Constitution was a direct replication of Haudenosaunee governance, the conceptual parallels, federalism, deliberation, distributed power, and checks on authority, illustrate that indigenous political systems provided both precedent and inspiration for colonial thinkers seeking durable models of governance. The encounter with Europeans also tested the Confederacy's adaptability. Trade, disease, and the shifting balance of power required leaders to respond with foresight, negotiation, and flexibility. While maintaining ethical and internal governance norms, the Haudenosaunee navigated alliances, mediated disputes, and leveraged external relationships to protect collective interests. Their success lay not in isolation or resistance alone, but in the integration of ethical principles, strategic calculation, and internal accountability. This capacity to engage dynamically with external powers while preserving internal cohesion underscores the Confederacy's political sophistication. Education and socialization continued to reinforce resilience during this period. Younger generations were taught the principles of leadership, the responsibilities of negotiation, and the ethical imperatives embedded in governance. They learned to understand European practices not as a model to imitate blindly, but as a complex external factor to engage with critically and strategically. By embedding knowledge of external relations within the broader framework of ethical and participatory governance, the Haudenosaunee ensured that their political structures could adapt to new challenges without compromising foundational principles. At the same time, contact with Europeans illuminated the broader significance of the Confederacy's governance structures. European colonists, often reliant on hierarchical authority, coercion, and centralized decision-making, were exposed to an alternative model, one in which ethical oversight, distributed power, and deliberative consensus ensured both unity and autonomy. The practical lessons of this system, how multiple nations could coordinate without coercion, how leadership could remain accountable, and how decisions could be made ethically and strategically, resonated quietly, influencing colonial observations and, in some cases, early political thinking. The Haudenosaunee demonstrated that governance rooted in ethics, relational authority, and consensus could function effectively across complex social and political networks. The encounters also underscored the Confederacy's long-term perspective. Leaders approached negotiations and alliances with an eye toward sustainability, intergenerational responsibility, and communal welfare. They evaluated European interactions not in isolation, but as part of a broader continuum, considering the impact on future generations, the cohesion of the Confederacy, and the preservation of ethical governance. This emphasis on foresight and ethical prudence ensured that the Confederacy could engage with external forces dynamically, yet maintain its internal coherence and moral grounding. Ultimately, the Haudenosaunee experience with European contact illustrates the resilience, adaptability, and strategic sophistication of the Confederacy's political system. It was a governance model capable of withstanding internal pressures and external threats, balancing autonomy with collective responsibility, and integrating ethical principles into practical decision-making. European observers noted its functionality, its durability, and, in some cases, its inspirational potential. The Confederacy navigated the complex intersection of diplomacy, trade, and military alliance with foresight, ethical oversight, and deliberative strategy, preserving both internal cohesion and long-term stability. In this context, the Confederacy's governance cannot be understood as static or isolated. Its interactions with Europeans were part of an ongoing process of adaptation, learning, and strategic engagement. Leaders, guided by ethical principles, deliberative processes, and oversight from women in councils, navigated these external pressures with sophistication, ensuring that the integrity of the Confederacy remained intact. The Haudenosaunee demonstrated that a political system grounded in ethics, distributed power, and relational accountability could withstand profound external challenges, providing a model of governance that was both resilient and visionary.